Hi, everybody. This week we are covering three artistic movements and a little bit extra. So what you're going to find out is that we're getting to a moment where the isms come faster and faster and movements are going to develop more and more rapidly. I mean, this reflects where we are in the 20th century in a changing world where ideas spread. And a lot of the artists that we're going to be looking at today were very, very international, living in different countries, living in different continents. Now, we're going to be looking at three primary movements that occur shortly before to shortly after World War I, and the theme of World War I is really important for all of these movements. So we'll be talking about Italian Futurism, about Dada, and about the later German Expressionist movement called New Objectivity. We're also going to start by looking at two artists who really come in the wake of Cubism and fit loosely on the margins of these groups, but who really don't belong to any group. And so first we're going to begin by talking about two sort of straggling artists, and then we'll look at these three movements. Now, the artist that we're beginning with is Marc Chagall. He is a very varied artist in terms of his production. He made paintings, he made prints like lithographs and etchings. He made sculptures, ceramics, tapestries, mosaics. He designed stained glass. We have instances of him making stage sets and costumes. So he's an artist who really is working in a lot of different medium, and he doesn't really fit neatly into any category. He's not part of one movement, but we can see his relationship to other movements. So we could see the way that he's following very clearly on the legacy of symbolism. We could see his relationship to Cubism in his treatment of space. We could see his relationship to the Fauves in terms of his relationship with color. And later on, artists like the Surrealists are going to look back on Chagall as a major influence because of his interest in dreams and in the unconscious. Now, he comes from a different background than artists that we've been looking at. He was a Russian-born artist. He was born in the town called Vitebsk, and Vitebsk is actually now in modern-day Belarus. But he grew up as part of a very large Jewish family. It was a Hasidic community, so very deeply religious. And actually, he grows up in a house where, because of religion, art wasn't really allowed, sort of figurative imagery. So he comes from this very different background, but that background of his interest in Russian and Jewish folklore and fables and tradition is going to have a very big impact on his work later on. And his work is incredibly personal, highly personal, and filled with references to fantasy and sort of poetry. Now, he is trained professionally as an artist. He went to art school in St. Petersburg, and he hated it. And in fact, you think about what academic art training was, this idea like we've talked about making copies after plaster casts of ancient sculptures. And Marc Chagall wrote about that. He said, I, poor country lad, was obliged to acquaint myself thoroughly with the wretched nostrils of Alexander of Macedonia or some other plaster imbecile. So he didn't last very long, and by the age of 24, he leaves Vitebsk and he goes to Paris, which brought him really into the circle of the Cubists and the Fauves, and he spends 4 years there, which most people look on as being his most important and his most creative. So we're going to look actually at only two works by Marc Chagall, and they are from the same year, which is 1913, which is 2 years after he first arrives in Paris. The first of them is really on the theme of the city of Paris, which is called Paris Through the Window. We see in a lot of Chagall's work during these Parisian years this sort of dueling conflict between these different worlds of his, the world of Paris and the world of Russia, the lure of the cosmopolitan city and his attachment to his home. And we can maybe see this in the figure on the bottom right-hand corner here, which is a figure with two heads, two faces on one head, let's say, one of them in light and one of them in darkness. It's sort of a figure from classical myth. It's a Janus figure, which is sort of a Roman god that's shown with these two heads. And here it's showing perhaps his sort of dual affinities. In any case, by the way, you'll notice he's looking out a window, which is not, this is an imaginary view of Paris, and in fact, the Eiffel Tower wasn't visible from his studio. But you'll also notice this odd cat on the windowsill with a human head, and that too might be a reference to classical myth, maybe like the idea of Cerberus, which is the dog that sort of guards the entrance to the underworld. So you can see that the world that he's painting is this Paris, right, marked by the Eiffel Tower, but completely dreamlike. And if we look in the work, we can see these odd details which suggest a world of fantasy. So we could see, for example, figures who were walking sort of with their feet sideways, like sort of perpendicular or parallel to the sidewalk. We could see a train, and maybe that's a train that returns to his home in Russia, but it's riding upside down. And we can see this wonderful image of this figure holding onto a triangular form in the sky, which might actually be a reference to a parachute jump. And actually in 1912, there was a quite infamous parachute jump where a man who went by the name of the Flying Tailor made himself a makeshift parachute and jumped off the Eiffel Tower. And you can watch the video of it. It didn't end well. There's the spoiler alert on that. And we actually have videos of this from 1912. But here you could see this figure sort of with this makeshift parachute flying down. It's also this figure flying down in what looks like a section that's got sort of the tricolor French flag on it. And so this is, you know, Chagall at these sort of dueling moments. So we can see the way that his art is related to Cubism. There was also a specific kind of Cubism called Orphic Cubism, which was very much interested in showing the movement of color, but it also fractured forms into these planes, the way that we saw Picasso and Braque do. And we see some reference to that here. So when we say that his work is influenced by Cubism, you could see the way that spaces are broken into geometric planes, that we see the figure from both profiles at the same time, which is sort of a Cubist idea, or that we're looking at objects from different points of view, which is also a Cubist idea. And yet we can also see this fauve sort of interest in this bright treatment of color. Now, it's in this same year that Chagall paints the first of his several self-portraits called the Self-Portrait with Seven Fingers, which is painted in his Paris studio. It shows the young artist at the age of 25, sort of very fancily dressed. He's got on sort of this bow tie, and he's got a boutonniere, the little flower tucked into his lapel. Now, before we look at the sort of odd details of the work, you can once again see Chagall's relationship to all these different art movements. And again, you can see why it's very hard to put him in any one box. We could see him thinking about Cubist space, you know, with the fracturing of forms and the geometric treatment of planes, the equal treatment of, for example, solid and void, which have the sort of same visual weight if you think back to Picasso. We could see him referring to fauvism in this very bright primary colored dominant palette, also with some green in it. He's even, on his collar, there's a piece of painted paper that was actually attached to the work, and that is probably this reference to Cubism and this idea of Cubist collage, which we saw with the analytical Cubist paintings of Picasso and Braque. And if you look, even here, you'll see some treatments where the paint is applied in a dotted sort of manner. And there are moments when Chagall is very much looking back towards Neo-Impressionism or sort of pointillism. So all of these different influences coming together in one work. But the work is probably, well, it is a self-portrait. So we know that it's the kind of picture that's going to be very personal to him. we notice that the picture can kind of be broken in half. If you drop a line down the central axis, there's sort of two themes in the work. In the top left-hand corner, we see again what we saw in the last work, which is a view of a window. Out through the window, we see the Eiffel Tower, and again, we see the parachute jumper, which is a wonderful detail, and it shows you something very common in Chagall, which is that themes reappear again and again. He has these motifs that are personal to him, and he uses them over and over. But the view out the window, or it could be a painting on a wall of Paris, is juxtaposed on the other side with this dream-like image of his hometown in Russia. So once again, we see the two paralleled against each other. And in fact, there's two words written across the top in sort of a combination of Russian and Yiddish, and the words say Paris and Russia. So this is, again, the two things that were so important to Chagall's identity and his development. And yet, in the picture, he's giving his attention to Russia. So you'll notice that he literally turns his back on the city of Paris, which is behind him out the window, and looks instead towards this dreamlike world and towards the picture that he's painting. Chagall actually made a statement like this. He said, "Participating in that unique technical revolution in art in France, I returned in thought, in the soul, so to speak, to my own country. I lived as if I were turned back to front." So we not only see the image of Vitebsk in the clouds and the word Russia, but we can also see that he's turning his face towards the canvas. Now, the picture on the canvas was actually a picture by Chagall that already existed. It's a picture that shows a milkmaid and a cow, and the milkmaid you could see is sort of flying in the air above the city, and she's literally lost her head, which is flying above. It is a painting very specifically of Russia. And this is a picture from 2 years earlier, which is called "To Russia, Asses and Others." Actually, he exhibited this picture for the first time in the Salon de Independence in 1912, where he called it "The Ant in the Sky," but he changes the name. But here again, we see him mixing sort of Russian folklore and Hebrew culture, and the idea that the red cow is something sacred in the Torah. So again, this is his sort of rethinking of his own tradition. By the way, the title got changed when a poet friend of his renamed the work. Now, okay, the other odd thing that should be addressed is the fact that it's called Self-Portrait with 7 Fingers. Now, Chagall had something to say about this. He said, "Why 7 fingers? To bring about another construction, to make fantastic elements appear beside realistic elements." So he says this is simply to make it fantasy, and obviously fantasy is something that's important to Chagall. But it also is from a Yiddish folk expression. When you say that you're doing something with 7 fingers, it means that you're doing it invested with your whole being, as good as you can. You're doing it really well, so you do it with more fingers. And at the same time, it sort of turns his hand into almost a menorah-like reference. And again, there's a lot of Jewish iconography and symbolism that plays in his work. Just to make it personal, it could be a reference to his own birthday. Chagall was born on the 7th day of the 7th month, that is July 7th, in 1887. And so that might be another sort of auspicious reference to himself and his biography. Okay, so that's all I'm going to show you of Chagall. I want you to see him because he's fascinating, and also show you the way that not every artist is part of a group and writing a manifesto. There are these artists that remain a little bit independent while having their feet in different camps. Now, the next artist we're going to look at actually does belong to a small group of painters, but he is really by far the most notable example of it, so we're only going to look at him. And we're talking about the movement called metaphysical art. It was an Italian art movement from around 1913 to 1920, so exactly during the years just before and just after World War I. And in Italian, we call it the Scuola Metafisica. The reference to metaphysical in Christian theology talks about a world after death, but for artists like Giorgio de Chirico, it has to do with the unworldly, the mysterious, and the imagined sort of world. Now, De Chirico and the metaphysical painters were very much interested in the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, which we've talked already about before, and Nietzsche's belief that there is another hidden reality that is sort of like parallel to our experience of the world. Nietzsche talked about the quote, foreboding that beneath this reality in which we live and have our being, another and altogether different reality lies concealed. So De Chirico's paintings are going to follow Nietzsche's belief, and we're going to see these pictures which suggest a fusion of reality and unreality. We're going to see him harkening back to much more classical modes of art, and by that I mean towards the Renaissance, where pictures were supposed to look like our world with perspective and a convincing reality, but then he creates these strange juxtapositions that make the picture remarkably unsettling. He is born in Greece, but his parents were Italian, and like De Chirico, he's an artist who's sort of very international. He learns to draw as a young man in Athens, but then after his father dies, he moved to Munich, at which point he came into contact with the artists of German Expressionism and Art Nouveau. He travels to Venice and Florence, Turin and Milan. So he travels around through Italy, and especially Turin, which had these very big, broad piazzas or open squares in front of buildings, influenced him. And he's in Paris in 1912 to 13. So then he's coming into contact with the world of the Cubists. So he's got many, many different influences, and he's traveling very widely. He rejects his metaphysical paintings after World War I, but they were considered his most influential. And like Marc Chagall, his pictures are going to be looked on as being very, very influential as sort of a precursor to the surrealists that we'll be getting to shortly. A very characteristic image of De Chirico's picture is his 1914 painting, The Melancholy and Mystery of a Street. You know, interestingly, De Chirico does train briefly as an engineer, and so you could almost see a lot of his pictures involve architecture that really emphasizes its geometry, almost sort of the mathematical quality of the picture. You know, he does this during maybe right after his Paris years. The dates that I have for him in Paris vary. And so again, he's come into contact with things like Cubism, which clearly here don't impact him in terms of form, but certainly his experience with seeing the avant-garde gave him the freedom to paint in a new kind of way. And here you can see what we mean by metaphysical picture, that there's a reality underneath the reality we see. All of the elements in the picture are recognizable to us and are painted in a what could read as a sort of figurative, illusionistic way. These objects look real and identifiable. We can see two arcaded buildings placed at an angle to the picture plane. You can see the series of arches. There is some sort of a freight car that's nothing's in it, but the doors open. And then we can see the evidence of two figures, the little girl who's spinning the hoop who runs in from the left-hand side. And we can see the shadow of another figure emerging out from behind the building. Now, he's using here devices that are also illusionistic. We have linear perspective, so the buildings are shown as if they're in a three-dimensional space, angling back to the picture plane. And we have cast shadows, which are a device that artists have long used to convince us that what we see in a picture is real. But what De Chirico likes to do is to take these things and then twist them so that instead of convincing us that this is a real occupiable space, it makes the picture unsettling and destabilizing. So for example, he uses perspective, but he exaggerates it, as in that white building, which literally goes into infinity so far away. And he'll use two different perspectival systems in one picture. So if you follow the lines of these two buildings, they don't meet at a common vanishing point. So we see perspective, but it's unsettling. Kind of like what we saw if we think like Edvard Munch's The Scream, where the perspective was so sort of forceful and dramatic, or Van Gogh's Night Cafe, where the perspective can actually give us a feeling of emotion. The same thing with the shadows. First of all, the girl, who is presumably a silhouetted figure of a girl, is shown as if she looks like a shadow. It's very she's painted exactly like shadows are, and so there's a level of what is real in this picture. But obviously we get a sense of the ominous because of the figure who comes out from behind the background. The light and shadow doesn't work in the same direction. So although he's showing cast shadows, not all of the cast shadows are aligned the way that they should be. And that too creates this destabilizing, inconsistent, it makes things feel threatening. So we see, again, he goes to Turin and he sees these big open architectural spaces, and that's what influences him. And so this is a sort of traditional urban setting with a ground paved, sort of like a paved ground and arcaded buildings, but it is like dreamlike. It's completely abandoned and devoid of civilization except for these two figures and the creepily abandoned car. So this is why his words, because their works show some sort of an alternative reality, this is why they often get called surreal, which is a term that we're going to see get used later on. And we can look at one more work from around this time called The Soothsayer's Recompense, which is interesting because it shows us some similar features and then some things that start to tweak the theme that we saw in The Melancholy and Mystery of the Street. There are similar features. So we see that same idea of these broad, uninhabited architectural spaces that, should be busy parts of a city but are devoid of activity. We see the interest in perspective, but at the same time, light and shadow, things which should make a picture look realistic and three-dimensional. But once again, the elements in the picture don't quite work together and create this sense of discord or unease to it. We also start to see de Chirico's, like Chagall, his reuse of the same motifs over and over again. So elements will appear multiple times in de Chirico's painting. So just like we saw the Chagall's use of the parachute figure. De Chirico in this work shows at least two objects he uses often in his works. One which is a train, and that could be because his father, I think, was a train engineer, so maybe a railway engineer, so that could be personal. But also this statue we see laying in the piazza. And you remember, de Chirico was born and trained early on in Greece, and this is a Greek Hellenistic statue of the sleeping Ariadne. So that has to do with the story. Ariadne in ancient myth was the daughter of King Minos, and she escapes from her father's palace. It's a long story. With the Greek hero Theseus, who becomes her lover, but then Theseus abandons her on the island of Naxos. So she's a reference to classical myth, but she also is a very real statue, which you can see here. There's several versions of this statue, but here you can see a later Roman copy of the sleeping Ariadne. So he's basing this on a real classical element. So like we say, de Chirico embraces his sort of connection to the past. But once again, these objects are uncomfortable because they are in this strange collision. So we see elements from the ancient world, as in the statue of Ariadne. We see the sort of Renaissance-inspired arched arcaded architecture. And then we see the modern elements of the steam engine train and of the clock. So there is this uneasy ambiguity, not just of where we are, but of when we are. So the picture becomes this pastiche of weird objects. Now, he could be using the train particularly to suggest something. It could be about melancholy and departure. So maybe, it's related to the story of Ariadne being abandoned by her lover Theseus. But De Chirico also was interested in the idea of the train as a metaphor for the journey to one's unconscious mind. And of course, sleep is that as well. And we see sleeping Ariadne. Once again, the space is abandoned. And there's interesting different juxtaposition in this work, or not juxtaposition, but an odd feature that makes the work more discomforting, which has to do with scale. So if we look, for example, you can see in the back there's a brick wall, and it's past the brick wall that we see the speeding locomotive train with the cloud. Those bricks and that train are not to scale. So either those bricks are enormous and the train is regular sized, or the bricks are to scale and the train is a miniature. It's just, again, him playing with these things and playing with things like perspective and scale to give us overall this sense of unease, that we're in this dreamlike space. Now we're going to move on to Futurism, which is another movement that really begins right around 1909. But these are artists who also came into contact in Paris with Cubism in 1911. And so from that point on, Cubism and Futurism share some common stylistic features, but they are going to be a very different group of artists. Futurism, first and foremost, was a literary movement, and the sort of founding member of the group was the man you see here pictured in the middle, Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, who was a poet, he was an editor, he was a playwright. And this was a group of very rebellious, strong intellectuals who were looking to move towards change. It was interested in unifying different arts. So when I say it was mostly a literary movement in the start, it also tried to encompass all the arts and create Futurism really as a way of life. And in terms of the visual arts, what you're going to see is there's not one unified style of what Futurism means. Now, what was interesting by the title, you can see that the Futurists were looking towards the future. They were a very nationalistic group, and this was at its heart an Italian movement. We sometimes call it Italian Futurism. And they called for the expansion of Italian industry and Italian territory. They extolled the beauties of revolution, of war, of violence. They were interested in the speed and the dynamism of the modern machine and technology. And in fact, the movement was originally called dynamism, but ultimately then takes on the name of Futurism. This sort of rebellious spirit you can see in their manifestos. And the Futurists wrote manifestos. They wrote one in 1909, another in 1910, and several after that. And really we've seen manifestos before, but beginning with Futurism, from this point on, the idea of the manifesto, the written document, is going to play an even greater and greater role in modern art. So in their foundation manifesto of 1909, they said, "We shall sing the love of danger, the habit of energy and fearlessness." As I said, they were not restricted to one mode of art. They were interested in things like painting, sculpture. They made music, photography, theater, architecture, and cinema. What they were interested in, which the name Futurism suggests, not only that they were forward-looking and that they were interested in technology, but also that they were really denigrators of the idea of the past. And that is something that is very clear in the writings, especially of Marinetti. He was against the idea of sort of good taste. He didn't think that there should be any imitation in art. He didn't like art critics. He disavowed traditional subjects like the painted nude, which had the grand tradition in art. He called Raphael disgusting and Michelangelo disgraceful. He disparaged the Italian cities. He called Rome a decaying corpse and Florence a cemetery. Now, what's interesting and makes a lot of sense is that the movement of futurism also sort of coincides with, scientific developments too. This is the time of Einstein's theory of special relativity, and it's also a time of war. And these are things that are going to push the futurists forward. And the futurists, because they saw war as something to help sort of fully break with the past, and a way to sort of cleanse society. A lot of these artists and futurists joined the war once World War I broke out. The movement would eventually die out by about 1916. Out of the major artists, a few of them had sort of turned in a different direction, like Cara and I think Russolo and Severini had gone a different way. Baccioni died in 1916 as a soldier. And then the one sort of remaining futurist that continued on is actually not pictured here, which is Giacomo Balla, which is where we're going to begin. Now, a great place to start, though it hardly seems political, is with the artist Giacomo Balla, who was actually the oldest member of the group. He was actually the teacher of Severini and Baccioni, who we're going to talk about. He had been a quite traditional portrait painter before Futurism, but he really makes this work, which is one of the sort of hallmarks of explaining Futurist style. Now, a lot of Futurism combines, as we talked about, this idea of the cubist sort of fragmentation and dissection of form with the interest in motion. And so this picture shows a very closely cropped, almost making it abstract, view of a female owner and her dachshund. Right, you can see the woman's skirt walking a dog, and it is called the dynamism of a dog on a leash. And that term comes back. That's dynamism is something the futurists are interested in. It also was a name for their movement. And it's actually something they wrote about in the Technical Manifesto of Futurist Painting, which was published in 1910. And it said, "All things move, all things run, all things are rapidly changing. Moving objects constantly multiply themselves. A running horse has not 4 legs, but 20. And that is what we see here. Now, Balla painted this image when he was in Montepulciano and he visited one of his students. And so we actually see these figures walking on this white ground, which is supposed to represent the sort of white dust of the Tuscan landscape. But, okay, so we see this woman walking a dog, and everything, therefore, is multiplied. The woman has about 15 feet, shown to greater or lesser degree of solidity. The dog has about 4 leashes. And the dog, the dachshund itself, has feet that look almost like they're becoming wheels. And this gets sort of compared to cartoons, like, Bugs Bunny cartoons when figures go fast. We do the same thing. There's sort of one body, but we see the legs over and over again, which is kind of interesting because on the one hand, we read this as motion, but yet the dog is not walking through space, and neither is the woman. We only see the multiplication of the legs. To enhance the idea of speed and movement, the artist used this diagonal placement of these ground lines. And you can actually even see in the bottom right-hand corner where the name itself, the signature of Balla, is put also on a diagonal. And the painted frame has this border on it that suggests a sense of rhythm and movement. It is supposed to be witty, that we see the movement of the dog's legs and the movement of the woman's legs, and they actually look quite like the same thing. Now, we can relate the dynamism of a dog on a leash to advances in photography. And actually, if we go back to photography at the end of the 19th century, the works that really come to mind are the works of Etienne Jules Marais and of Edward Muybridge. And they both sort of pioneer what was called the chronophotograph. And the chronophotograph was a technique where multiple photographs were taken in rapid succession so that you could capture movement. So, for example, when these photographs were taken, Marais would put this sort of reflective tape on the joints and on the arms, and otherwise dress the figures in black, and he would take up to 60 frames per second. So the chronophotograph really becomes the predecessor to cinema and to film. But this sort of idea became really important for artists like the Futurists, who were trying also to record this kind of motion. Now, I talk about the wit of the sort of play of the dog's rapidly moving legs against the woman's rapidly moving feet. And you do get a sense that Bala had a little bit of wit himself. And this is a 1913 photograph that shows him in front of his painting. And while the photograph was being taken, he too set himself in motion. Now we'll look at a work by Gino Severini, who was a pupil of Bala. He really is the greatest link between the Italian artists, who many of which had settled in Milan, and the world of Paris. So like he's the one who insisted that the Futurists come to Paris and see what was going on in the art world. And he shows us the connection to the art of the recent past. Now, we said that they didn't agree with imitation or looking back on the past, but that really for them meant up until Impressionism. So like the world of Michelangelo and Raphael was decrepit and decayed and rotten, but they saw the Impressionists as being the artists who had, in a sense, begun to rectify what had come before. So they were sort of the beginning of this new movement. And you can see some commonalities between Severini's dynamic hieroglyphic of the Baal Tabarin and the works of the Impressionists and the Post-Impressionists. First of all, in terms of subject matter, and this is the subject matter of the sort of carnival-like atmosphere of nightlife. And nightlife is a subject that we saw Manet take on, and certainly we looked at Toulouse-Lautrec as well, but it was a subject that many artists of the Impressionist and Post-Impressionist who were interested in studying modern life were particularly interested in. So Severini here is very purposefully calling to mind a few different styles. We certainly can see the reference to sort of the cubist grid and the fracturing of form. And like we saw in the analytic cubist works of Braque and Picasso, he's modeling the individual geometric forms from light to shade. So you notice, like, if there's a triangle of color, like we see here, like this triangle of color, it's not a flat triangle of color. It has darkness and light, like shadow, which is something that the cubists were still doing. So there was still this vestigial reference to three-dimensional space. Likewise, there was an interest in collage, which is an element that came straight out of Cubism. And even though this is a work of oil on canvas, there are actual sequins glued onto the work to represent the embroidery and beading of costumes. And to take this even further, we certainly have the reference to lettering across a picture, which is something that we saw the Cubists like Braque and Picasso pursue. By the way, there's sort of these very wonderful also overt references to works that we've seen from Post-Impressionism or Art Nouveau. So if you look in the foreground, there is the detail of sort of like part of a cello. You could see part of like a stringed musical instrument here just cutting into the frame. And it's supposed to make us feel like we are sort of behind the the band. We're like looking over the orchestra. So I mean, it's closely, sharply cropped, and that sort of cropping is something that we've seen Toulouse-Lautrec do in his print Jane Avril, and we saw Degas play with that close cropping and abrupt compression of space as well. So Severini is picking that up. But you know, this kind of subject, as much as it has now a reference to the art of the more recent past, it also was perfectly appropriate for the futurists because of this idea that they were revolting against bourgeois, you know, morality. So the sort of nightlife, frenetic, chaotic scene would have been appropriate. Now, of course, we have to pick apart and see what it is that this picture is about. And the picture on the whole, by the way, those are those words that are written across the picture. You can see it says polka, it says valse or waltz, and there are some other words as well. But so almost like we saw in, you know, some other works where sort of dance hall words were written on the wall, we see the same thing here. The picture itself, though, is a scene of a dance, and there's at least one and probably two women dancing. We can see this woman with the sort of brownish hair, and she's wearing a purple and pink dress. And you'll notice that, like as in Bala, we see her multiple times, although we actually see her moving through space, which we didn't really see in Bala the same way. Almost like she's spinning around the dance floor. And so we see her here and here and here and here in multiple fragmented planes. There seems to be another dancer, maybe in the blue dress, when this could be ribbons or hair, but we see her multiple times throughout the picture as well. There are people observing, right? You can notice that in the bottom left foreground, there's a still life with martini glasses on a table and a woman with a blue coat who's laughing on the left-hand side. And we see a counterpart to that figure on the right-hand side, who's the man in the top hat, kind of like we saw in Manet's bar, with a monocle. In the very distance, there are what appear to be some strange, fantastic elements. So we're setting some sort of dance hall. You could see streamers hanging from the ceiling and garlands and flags. And again, there's that sort of nationalistic sense that we have to Futurism, again, even though this work does not seem political. But we can make out some weird details like the nude woman on a pair of scissors in the background, and there's also a figure, sort of like an Arab figure on a camel in the distance. Now, the meaning of this is not as clear. Some people have suggested that the man on the camel is a reference to political events like the Turco-Italian War of 1911. But it's also possible that these figures were supposed to represent cabaret performances or costume parties with themes and sort of the kind of things that we would expect to have at one of these chaotic, dynamic places. So, okay, definitely you can see the reference to Cubism, but of course we have the application of more fauve-like colors, very bright, and if you look up close, and you can see it here, you'll notice that some of the surfaces are painted with stipples, little dots of paint. And so we also see this nod to the past in terms of neo-impressionism or pointillism or divisionism. Now, maybe the artist we most associate with the movement of Italian Futurism is Umberto Boccioni. Boccioni was maybe the most visually inventive out of all of the futurists, and he played the major role of bringing forth a sort of futurist sculpture, which we'll look at. But just wanted to show you a small group of works by him as a painter. He, by the way, died during World War I. Again, many of the futurists rushed to join the war because they saw this as being some sort of opportunity for cleansing and destruction of sort of what was seen as a decrepit society. And he ended up dying in 1916 during cavalry exercises in Verona. Now, this is a group of pictures, a trilogy. or a triptych. It's a three-part picture, which maybe trilogy is more appropriate because it sounds cinematic, and the futurists are thinking that way. But this takes up another subject that was favored by the futurists because we know of their interest in technology, that the subject of the train becomes a sort of symbol of modern life and machinery and progress. And by the way, the Impressionists loved the trains too. Monet did a whole series of the Gare Saint-Lazare, the train station in Paris, where he was more interested in the wonderful visual effects you would get from the smoke. But for Boccioni and the Futurists, it was this opportunity to study movement. And so the same ideas apply here. We can see the sort of references to Cubism, you know, the sort of idea of breaking forms down into facets that are interwoven into flattened geometric forms instead of sort of, you know, three-dimensional shapes. We can see the Cubist reference to letters. We can see the letters 6943 in the top, which are a reference to the numbers on a train. But whereas Boccioni thought that Cubism, he called it an image of death. He said it was like a dissection, like looking at something in a museum of natural history, like a diagram. The thought was that Futurism brought this sense of life to the work. So again, this was supposed to be somewhat cinematic. We're looking at three pictures that are supposed to represent a train arriving and people departing on the train. So the first one is the farewells. So this is the train approaching. The second one is those who go. And then so you see the train departing. And the last one are those who stay, which is about the people left behind. So here you can see that there is a sense of mood being achieved here. And he does this by translating movement into what he called force lines. So you could see these lines that are showing direction, and you could see how the movement of the lines changes in every work. In the farewells, it appears as if this train with that 6943 written on it is advancing and moving towards you. In those who go, it appears like it's moving away, and you could see the diagonal lines. And then in the last work, those who stay, you can see the sort of force lines are very vertical, which gives us this sense of stability. It's what's left. The things are no longer in motion. It is literally what's left behind. Likewise, the color changes in each work, with the artist relying more heavily on warm colors in the farewells and then shifting to cool colors for the sort of sadness and mood of the other two works. I'm just blowing this up so you could see it a little more clearly. So the smoke sort of created in these circular movements, and again, you could see force lines, these sort of circular force lines, which give us a sense of the advancing steam engine. You can see the reference to pointillism or neo-impressionism or divisionism in the choice of using this stippled technique, and we can also still see the lingering interest in fauve colors. But as I said, what we think of as Boccioni's great contribution was his contribution to Futurist sculpture. And he had actually seen Picasso's sculpture in Paris in 1912, and then in 1912, Boccioni wrote his technical manifesto of Futurist sculpture, which, like other Futurist manifestos, began with an attack on academic tradition, particularly on the subject of the nude. And then he set about to talk about what sculpture should do, the eternal value of sculpture, which should be, as the Futurists, as you would expect, about movement, and also about the way that the form and its environment are sort of supposed to interpenetrate. You know, that two things, the way the form moves through space, the form and space are sort of defined together. The figure is part of the environment. And I also wonder how much of that, just like you can imagine some of the interest in sort of theorizing about motion, might have to do with sort of the studies of Einstein and the changes in the way that we understand the world on a sort of molecular level. I mean, the futurists talked about the way that there is this sort of idea of universal creation. And so they wrote, no one can any longer believe that an object ends where another begins. And so you can see in this sculpture that there's no clear line that separates the figure from the space around it. And again, that's something I think the Cubists are already playing with Picasso, and the Futurists take it a step further. And so what we're looking at here, interestingly, is also what seems to be like a very traditional sculpture in a sense, because it is a sculpture of a striding human figure, which is very classicizing. Here it's just, but it's given this very non-personal subject of the unique forms of continuity in space. And that is keeping with the the futurist interest in what we call simultaneity. In other words, it's about movement, but movement all shown at this sort of simultaneous moment. But Boccioni didn't cast any of these. So he's a sculptor, and as we talked about when we looked at Rodin, that meant that he worked usually in plaster to make models. He never actually cast any of them, but and he made 4 versions of this statue, and 3 of them were destroyed, I think at his directive when he died. Only the 4th one survived. So that was just him being like hypercritical. And then it was cast into several versions in bronze. And so it is rather interesting because this is now a striding figure which feels sort of traditional, and it is a very traditional medium, which is bronze. And that's not how the futurists thought about sculpture. They thought about using every kind of material when they made a sculpture. Yet this is one of the most traditional. So we don't even know if he wanted the sculpture to ever be cast and how he wanted it to be cast. Now, when I say the striding figure is quite traditional, every time people look at Boccione's unique forms, they relate it to a work of antiquity. Specifically, the Greek Hellenistic statue of the Nike of Samothrace, which is in the Louvre Museum in Paris. And obviously there's good reason. This is a Nike. It's a winged victory figure that was shown as if it was just alighting, probably on the prow of a ship. So you can see the wings flutter out behind and the drapery moving, and you can see how much of that dynamism, the swirling drapery patterns turn into these sort of cubist shifting planes on Boccione's body, almost like he's trying to translate a cubist painting into 3 dimensions or a 3-dimensional figure into 2 dimensions. The fact that this looks so much like this famous Nike is interesting because Marinetti, who was the founder of Futurism, did not like this particular statue, and he talked about it. He said, a roaring motor car, which looks as though running on shrapnel, is more beautiful than the victory of Samothrace. So again, this idea that we should overthrow the past. In any case, it is this perfect idea of futurism in that it looks both organic and like it is dynamic and in motion, but it also has this reference to the machine age. It looks like equal parts like robotic and gladiator, and it's all just full of energy and motion. And so this was Boccione's big contribution. And as we said, he dies just 3 years later, in cavalry exercises in Verona, which sort of puts an end, of course, to his fantastic experiments with futurist sculpture.